Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me today for the presentation Work Health and Safety 101 Due Diligence for Officers. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. As you are all hopefully aware, the new Work Health and Safety Act 2012 commenced in South Australia on the 1st of January 2013. Over this last year, SafeWork SA has presented extensively on the new laws generally, with the theme of familiar principles, new approach, and that's an important point to keep in mind. While today we'll be discussing the new element of officer duties, the core principles of safety remain the same as those we were all already familiar with. The Act is based on a national model Act which was developed by SafeWork Australia for jurisdictions to adopt. The introduction of the new laws has brought South Australia into a harmonised system together with New South Wales, Queensland, Tasmania, the ACT, the Northern Territory and the Commonwealth. The aim of harmonised laws is to provide all workers in Australia with the same standard of health and safety protection regardless of where they do their work or the type of work that they do. It has also ensured that there are consistent compliance and enforcement arrangements in place across Australia. So turning to the duty at hand today, and I won't dwell on this issue as it's no longer relevant, but under the old law, South Australia had responsible officers, which essentially meant that businesses could nominate one person at any level in the organisation to be responsible for health and safety issues. What the WHS Act does is to place an obligation on all officers of a business or undertaking. That is, people who are officers by virtue of their role and position in the business must meet the duty, not someone who is delegated or assigned that responsibility. Throughout the presentation, I will outline why the duty was introduced, who it applies to, what it requires, and how this can be achieved. So let's start with the why. It's important to understand why the officer duty exists and why it matters. Businesses act through and at the instruction of their officers. The rationale is summed up neatly in the first report of the National Review into Occupational Health and Safety Laws that was undertaken to review all WHS laws nationally. It states, "A corporation is an artificial entity that cannot make decisions or act other than through individuals. A corporation cannot comply with the duty of care placed upon it unless those who manage the corporation make appropriate decisions to ensure necessary actions are taken. They are known as officers." So the reasoning for introducing the duty of officers is that there is a need for senior management to show leadership with regard to the corporate safety agenda, which is critical to positive safety outcomes. Officers, through their decision-making, influence the behaviours and the activities and determine the course of action that will be taken on a wide variety of issues. One of these, of course, is the outcome of health and safety in their workplace. Officers establish the context, the conditions, and the culture for a safe working environment. They establish initiatives and make decisions on resources and policies. The primary duty in the WHS Act rests on the person conducting a business or undertaking, the PCBU. That duty is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers while at work. But as we've just noted, the PCBU operates through its officers. Therefore, Section 27 of the WHS Act places a duty on officers to exercise due diligence to take reasonable steps to support a health and safety culture, ensure accountability, and ensure consideration of WHS in the allocation of resources and the development of policies. This brings us then to who the duty applies to. The term officer is defined in the WHS Act as an officer within the meaning of Section 9 of the Corporations Act 2001 of the Commonwealth, other than a partner in a partnership. And I should apologise, I am reading directly from the legislation at the moment, just to make sure that we're accurate about what exactly that definition is. Subsection B of the definition is an officer of the Crown within the meaning of Section 247 of the WHS Act, or an officer of a public authority within the meaning of Section 252 of the WHS Act. So we'll look at each of these more closely, and I'll just start with the second box on the slide there, an officer within the meaning of Section 247. That means a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of a business or undertaking of the Crown, so the government. The third box on the slide is an officer of a public authority within the meaning of Section 252. This means a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business or undertaking of a public authority. Now, public authority is also defined in the Act as an agency of the government or an administrative unit or department within the public service of any state or commonwealth. So now just going back to the first box, which is probably the broadest part of the definition, an officer within the meaning of Section 9 of the Commonwealth Corporations Act 2001. So if we look at Section 9, it states that an officer means a director or secretary of the corporation, a person who makes or participates in making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business or undertaking of that corporation, a person who has the capacity to affect significantly the corporation's financial standing, for example, a chief financial officer, or a person in accordance with whose instructions or wishes the directions of the corporation are accustomed to act. Section 9 also lists a receiver, an administrator, a liquidator, a trustee. Volunteer officers on boards are also considered to be officers. So what this definition shows then is that officers are the top level key decision makers, the people whose decisions significantly affect the workings of the organisation. It's also critical to note that the Act makes it clear that a duty cannot be transferred to another person. Therefore, an officer owes the duty themselves and cannot delegate it. When a person doesn't neatly fit into one of the listed categories, they may not be sure if they are indeed an officer. What we advise is to err on the side of caution. The worst case scenario for someone who satisfies the duty and is actually later found by a court not to be an officer is that they know more about work health and safety issues in their workplace than they otherwise needed to, and that's not a bad outcome. The other side of that, however, is that if a person is in fact an officer but fails to comply with the duty, they could be held liable and face significant penalties. So in determining who is an officer, it's also important to be clear about who isn't. And that some of those are included within the Act, such as ministers of a state or the Commonwealth acting in that capacity, in that ministerial capacity, and elected councillors acting in that capacity. Beyond that, it's clear that due to the focus on the person making decisions that affect the whole or a substantial part of the business, it's not intended to apply to team supervisors, line managers, HR or OHS managers. Further, simply because a person may have the word officer in their job title also doesn't automatically make them an officer. For example, police officers or policy officers. A question is also often raised about the standing of volunteer officers. Now, volunteer officers are officers and they do owe the duty of due diligence. The only difference is that they cannot be prosecuted as officers. As mentioned earlier, the duty on a PCBU is the primary duty, and that is to ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health and safety of workers engaged or caused to be engaged, and workers whose activities in carrying out work are influenced or directed by the person while the workers are at work in the business or undertaking. And again, obviously that is directly from the legislation, that duty. The duty of an officer is that they must exercise due diligence to ensure that the PCBU complies with its duty. The advantage of placing a positive duty on officers is that it requires them to take active steps to make sure the PCBU meets its primary duty of care at all times. The officer will be personally liable if they fail to do whatever is reasonably necessary to the extent of their ability to do so to ensure the business complies with its duty. So if officers need to exercise due diligence, what is it? That is also defined in the Act at section 27, subsection 5, as taking reasonable steps to do the following 6 things. Now, the key term here is reasonable steps. What that is for every officer in every type of business won't always be the same. So it's important to keep in mind that in exercising due diligence, you should do what it's reasonable to do in your situation in the following 6 areas. Acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. Gain an understanding of the nature of the operations of the business or undertaking and of the hazards and risks associated with those operations. Ensure that the PCBU has available for use appropriate resources and processes to eliminate or minimise risks to health and safety from work carried out as part of the conduct of the business or undertaking. Ensure that the PCBU has appropriate processes for receiving and considering information regarding incidents, hazards and risk, and responding in a timely way to this information. Ensure that the PCBU has and implements processes for complying with any duty or obligation of the PCBU under the Act. And finally, verify the provision and use of these resources and processes. Now, these 6 elements aren't discrete topics, they are interrelated and cumulative in nature. They represent a unified system for ensuring compliance. So how do officers demonstrate each of these? Let's go through each of the points now and I'll offer more detail about what could be included. So firstly, take reasonable steps to acquire and keep up-to-date knowledge of work health and safety matters. This is a general criteria requiring knowledge of work health and safety in a broad sense. Practically, it requires officers to engage in training and information monitoring. An obvious way to achieve this is through officer WHS training, but this doesn't necessarily need to be formal. While it could be achieved through attending available training sessions on WHS matters, it could also be achieved via executive training and briefings, as well as through subscriptions to publications and websites which provide information on legislative and industry developments. This would ensure officers gain knowledge about changes to legislation, case law developments and relevant Australian standards. Sound safety performance reporting would also form part of this step. Safety reports to boards, executive management and senior management keep officers up to date of what is happening at the other levels of the organisation. Regular and detailed information and updates about health and safety performance and emerging issues is one way to achieve this. The next component of due diligence is to take reasonable steps to gain an understanding of the nature of the operations of the business or undertaking and of the hazards and risks associated with those operations. Now, this component brings the focus directly on the particular business. Officers need to know and understand their business and develop an understanding of the hazards and risks associated with its operations. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that officers should be engaging in routine supervision of work or that they should interfere with the day-to-day management of a business. But what it does require is that they introduce safety checks and balances that are relevant and appropriate to the work that the business conducts. A hazard management plan could be developed to deal with hazards which present a risk. This should identify hazards associated with core business activities, and these must be communicated to and understood by the management. Officers need to understand what specific WHS compliance is required in relation to their operations, and they need to be able to confirm that the organisation can satisfy those. Further measures that could ensure this aspect is met include ensuring regular inspections of the workplace are undertaken, holding regular briefings from lower level managers about operational issues to highlight any risks in operations, and conducting surveys or focus groups with workers regarding hazards. The third component is to take reasonable steps to ensure that the PCBU has available for use appropriate resources and processes to eliminate or minimise risks to health and safety from work carried out as part of the conduct of the business or undertaking. To achieve this, of course, officers need to read and understand all internal WHS policies and procedures and establish these in consultation with workers. It's also critical the right people are properly empowered to take action when needed and that there is access to workers with particular safety expertise. It could be useful for officers to identify a budget for WHS matters, including improvements to infrastructure and the working environment. The allocation of resources for WHS needs to be in line with and appropriate to the size and nature of the business, though. Doing these things will ensure the organisation's investment in safety infrastructure through tasks such as developing safety management systems, policies and procedures, SafeWork procedures, training workers in all of those procedures and processes, investment in control measures, as well as auditing and improvement of existing processes. The fourth component is to take reasonable steps to ensure that the PCBU has appropriate processes for receiving and considering information regarding incidents, hazards and risk, and responding in a timely way to this information. The review of incidents to identify deficiencies and ensure corrective and preventative action is taken to ensure that similar incidents are prevented is, of course, critical. However, in terms of this component, simply relying on incident reporting wouldn't be advised, as it sees the organisation respond after an incident has occurred, rather than taking a comprehensive risk management approach to actively and decisively identifying and eliminating hazards and risks. What is needed is the establishment of formal reporting requirements, not only for incidents, but, as I mentioned, hazards and risks as well. Reporting tools need to allow workers to outline concerns or issues and also allow officers to adequately assess the information that's presented to them in a timely way that reflects the seriousness of the issue being raised. Establishing response plans, including emergency responses, would also obviously be a key component of this. The fifth component is to take reasonable steps to ensure that the PCBU has and implements processes for complying with any duty or obligation of the PCBU under the WHS Act. The duty of officers requires them to take active steps to ensure that the organisation is complying with its duties. To achieve this, officers are required to ensure that the following is done and reported back to them: that all policies and processes are reviewed to ensure they are compliant with WHS laws, that officers are able to identify particular legislative requirements or standards that apply to the day-to-day operation of their business and can verify that these are being met, and the officers understand all the duties and obligations of a PCBU and ensure its compliance with them. For example, reporting notifiable incidents to SafeWork SA, consulting with workers, ensuring workers are given appropriate training and instruction about WHS, and that licensing and registration obligations are met. The final step is to take reasonable steps to verify the provision and use of these resources and processes. In essence, this comes down to audit and review, ensuring there are regular safety audits, drills, checkups or meetings, and ensuring WHS is maintained as a priority and continually reviewing this. Officers should take active steps to verify that the systems that have been developed are in place, being used as they should be, and are working. Officers could be personally involved in safety. Things like safety observations, safety walks, toolbox talks are all things that officers could do to be close to the work and the workers and to demonstrate their commitment to safety. So that's it. The criteria isn't meant to be exhaustive, as I said, but interrelated and cumulative in nature. Now, as noted earlier, the duty of officers can't be delegated. Officers can be prosecuted and found guilty of an offence even if the PCBU is not. And penalties are based on the degree of culpability and the risk or degree of harm. For a Category 1 offence, the maximum penalty for officers is up to $600,000 and or 5 years jail. Now this, of course, though, is for the most serious breaches and requires recklessness on the part of the officer. The penalty for a Category 2 offence is up to $300,000, and for a Category 3 offence is up to $100,000. I mentioned it earlier, but it is worth reiterating that while volunteer officers owe a duty of due diligence, they cannot be prosecuted as officers and therefore wouldn't be subject to these penalties. So that's all the key information. I just wanted to quickly recap briefly what is required step by step. So in a nutshell, know everything you can as an officer about WHS. Get an understanding of WHS in your business. What are the hazards? What are the risks? Make sure your business has appropriate resources to get rid of or minimise those hazards and risks. Make sure there are processes in place to be told about WHS issues and that they can be responded to quickly. Make sure the business has a way of complying with its duty, and confirm the provision of and use of resources and processes used for WHS purposes. So if your business already has systems in place which demonstrate the management commitment to WHS and recognise the responsibility for it, now is a good time to review your systems in line with the elements of due diligence, make sure each of the elements is covered, and make sure suitable records and evidence can be produced if necessary to demonstrate that compliance. If your business doesn't have existing systems in place, you must, as soon as possible, identify who your officers are and therefore who owes a duty. You should develop, implement, monitor and review WHS procedures and processes to ensure the active involvement of your officers, and you should provide training to officers to enable them to effectively carry out these functions. As I've outlined, due diligence includes taking reasonable steps. An officer wouldn't be held liable for an incident if it was clear that they took reasonable steps in those circumstances to ensure they had complied with the duty. Now, what is reasonable will, of course, depend on the particular circumstances, including the role and influence able to be exercised by a particular officer. So I'll leave you then with just a few key points to keep in mind. Firstly, WHS is a shared responsibility. A workplace where all parties are invested and involved and where there is a collaborative and constructive environment will always lead to greater safety outcomes. The duty of officers is important in placing individual responsibility on senior staff. It means the key decision makers are motivated to ensure that health and safety considerations become part of normal business planning. And finally, good safety management is good business. If the welfare and productivity of workers is improved, your bottom line will be improved and your business will be more successful. Further information about officer duties and about the work health and safety laws more generally is available both on the SafeWork SA website and the SafeWork Australia website listed, or by phoning the SafeWork SA Help Centre.